My name is Maddie. I'm a Mellon Fellow in the Digital Humanities program at the University of Rochester. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our program today, which is called Putting Theory to Practice, a discussion of data feminism. And the reason that we came up with this event is because we had the Neely lecture last night with Lauren Klein and D'Ignazio about their book, Data Feminism, which I have here. And we wanted to kind of open the conversation further to people who are working with what we thought were data feminist practices in the field, specifically people who are working in the Rochester area or the Western New York area. We have someone from Bucknell with us today. And yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the conversation over to Amy. And so, yeah, just to give it a little more background, today we're going to be kind of focusing on the 7 principles of data feminism that are discussed in the text, which are examine power, challenge power, elevate emotion and embodiment, rethink binaries and hierarchies, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Amy.
Okay, thank you so much for having us and for setting this up. The truth is that someone on my team, Holly, gave me the Data Feminism book, and I, thought it was a really beautiful book, and it also really tracked a lot of where my organization is going. So I'll explain a little bit about who I am. I'm the executive director, CEO of Measures for Justice, which is an organization in Rochester, New York. And the organization was founded on the idea that people don't have meaningful and trusted data that they can use to generate lasting change in criminal justice. I had written a book called Ordinary Injustice, and there's a story I always tell about a prosecutor in Quitman County, Mississippi, who has no idea he hasn't prosecuted a domestic violence case in 21 years. But if you go around to the other counties in that area, they could tell you that they did prosecute. So the question was, could you begin to put out there what people were charged with in terms of crimes, racial disparities, who was being punished for what and for how long, and create action in a community. And it seems like a really simple concept, right? Well, it was really hard in the beginning. And the idea was, the vision is to really give communities and practitioners their own data so that they can rally to create real systemic change. So the first thing that we did was we did a study in Wisconsin, and we came out with measures, and no one had ever really created these comparative criminal justice measures before. And we put them out in Wisconsin and shortly after 5 other states. But it was a huge, huge deal, not only because the data was messy, but because people really didn't want the data to be used. I remember this one judge saying to me, you can't compare counties. One's an apple and one's an orange. And I was like, well, why can't you compare an apple and an orange? One's red and smooth, the other's, orange and bumpy. And he said, but I don't want a tomato in my fruit salad. And I always thought about that. Like, what does that mean? And I think what he really means is, like, get out of my state. We don't want to involve the community. We don't want to have people seeing what we're doing. And so I think our initial value was, we just got data out there. We did 20 states worth of data and we got it out there. But what we found was that the data wasn't getting used in the way we'd like. Like, it went out there and, we had some, state level change where states like Florida created data laws based on our measures. And the measures are things like, people in jail for under $500 bail. The only reason that they're there is they can't pay the $500. And then you can filter that by race and by sex and by age. And so we really started thinking about, how do we begin to create products on the local level so that people can use it. And it was right around this time where we're starting to think about this way to engage the community that I started thinking about some of the principles in data feminism, although I hadn't read the book yet. But what we started thinking about is, the idea of co-creation, with the idea that whoever participates in the process really becomes part of the solution. If data are a means to change, and they are a major means to change, then whoever uses the data will define criminal justice really in the coming decades. So we started thinking about how could you get communities and practitioners to collaborate together. And just around the time we were talking about all of this and like really getting the data used on the local level, we started partnering with a prosecutor in Yolo County, California. And Yolo is where Davis is based. It's really near West Sacramento, or it is part of West Sacramento. And we found this prosecutor who had a multicultural community council that he works with, but they had a problem in that they never really knew what the problems were, because change really can't happen without facts. There's no facts, so there's no accountability, and there's no actions, and there's no transparency. So that's how I think a lot of distrust happens, when there isn't that sort of transparency. So we started working with not only this prosecutor, but this community group to create a portal of live data. And that live data portal just launched 2 weeks ago. It's called Commons. And the idea is, could you create a common set of language, a common goal, a common place where you can talk about things? And so to get a commons, the prosecutor has to work with the community, and they have to agree to set a goal, and they have to agree to give us a live stream of data so that we can do the data analytics. And what we found is something that data feminism really talks about, which is the people who experience the criminal justice system know the problems extremely intimately. And they thought of things on the portal that we never would have thought of. Like, there's this one button where you have to, once you have your data point, you can push and you can send a picture of the data point to local media, to local officials, so that you could create a media campaign very quickly of people sending, saying, fix this, fix this, fix this. We learned that people really want the police data, and so I know we're adding that in. And we also really learned that communities know what goes uncounted and have ideas of how to solve problems. But the problem is that the system isn't built to have these continuous exchanges based on facts. I also want to say one other thing that I really liked about the data feminism book, which is, this idea of neutrality. And we consider ourselves nonpartisan, but we've really stopped using the word nonpartisan because there is no such thing. So we now talk about having a common language instead of a neutral language. Anyway, the final thing is, I do think that one thing in the data feminism book that I found extremely helpful was this notion that the ultimate is having the people really own the data and take care of it. We're not there yet because, we're still, scaling our model, but there ultimately should be a way, because that's how I think we'll really find the brilliant solutions, if we can bring people into the process more to clean and code the data and house the data. And they'll be running analytics that we never would have thought of that really could, end up changing things. Well, I think I've gone over my 5 minutes, but that's a start for my interest in data feminism.
Thank you, Amy. I'm excited to talk more during the Q&A. Okay, we're going to pass things over to John, whenever you're ready.
Perfect. So I am going to use some PowerPoint slides as a crutch. This is how I I remember things now. My brain is a little broken after this semester. So I'm a philosophy professor, and I think of myself as being in the middle of this intersection of three things. So I sometimes call myself a political philosopher of science, which is an amalgam of these kind of three things that I care about. One is political philosophy, and in particular, broadly feminist political philosophy that's interested in the intersection of race and gender and justice. And then also philosophy of science, and in particular feminist philosophy of science that asks questions about what makes science science, what kinds of values are embedded in science already, and what kinds of kind of epistemic authority, what kind of authority different kinds of science can have. And I take both those kind of theoretical areas of philosophy and I apply them to a bunch of questions in data science, public health, technology. I've done some stuff on environmental science, anything that's kind of sciencey. And I'm interested in the kind of really quite the fine-grained details of those areas. And what I think is interesting is when you think about the kind of intersection of all those different areas, you get to ask quite kind of pertinent questions. And I think this is what the Data Feminism book is really doing. They're not using the language that I would necessarily use, but they're asking these kinds of questions, right? Like, what is a just science? Like, what does science that's oriented towards justice look like? Who should control how we balance the benefits and risks of scientific inquiry, right? Because it's not value neutral, right? As Amy was saying, right? It's embedded with all sorts of different commitments already and power imbalances. And then secondly, when we think about the intersection of this broadly political philosophy, these questions in political philosophy and things like data science, we have to think about, well, how do we fairly allocate the benefits and burdens of new technologies like machine learning algorithms? How do we rectify, or do we have a responsibility to rectify the prior injustices that have made our medical system so unequal, right? And then who gets to decide how to govern technologies in the future, right? These are all, I think, the kind of central kind of questions that the Data Feminism book tries to answer. That's why, I found its approach really, really wonderful, right? Really refreshing. I'll give you two examples of projects that I'm doing to give you a bit more of a kind of fine-grained idea. So one thing that I'm interested in is how we measure fairness in algorithmic systems. And there's been this recent trend towards trying to measure the fairness of machine learning-based decision systems. A really good example of this is the interest in the Compass Parole algorithm. So this is an algorithm that rates the risk to the community of releasing someone from prison, right? It's used in New York State, it's used in Wisconsin, it's used in Florida. And there's been a lot of concern that this algorithm is racially biased. There was a big study in ProPublica 3 years ago now, 2018, where they took two kind of cases, this case of Brisha Borden and Vernon Prater. Brisha was a young Black woman who was arrested for stealing a bike. She was rated as high risk, right? When she was eventually, and was not released, when she was eventually released, she did not reoffend. Vernon Prater was a 40-year-old white male with a very long history of violent and non-violent crime. He was later as low risk and released on parole. He then went on to engage in a number of armed robberies. And the kind of general pattern that people have observed bear out these fine-grained, embodied stories of injustice, right? Black defendants appear to be more likely to score highly on this risk score, white defendants less so. And there's been a lot of interest in this question and a lot of attention from the computer science community. And one of the things that I've been interested in is that the measures of fairness that the computer science community have been using are kind of flawed in ways that a feminist philosopher of science would be able to identify pretty quickly, right? They often treat background injustice as if it's neutral and really only focus on the injustice embedded in the algorithmic decisions or the additional injustice that the algorithm decision would do. They ignore differences in the needs of populations. That's not quite so easy to see in the Parole case, but it's easy to see in a medical case where you might be distributing resources to different communities. A fair distribution might take into account how much need is in a particular community or a particular gender, right? Rather than simply equally distributing resources. Finally, you might think, listen, measures of fairness actually explicitly exclude the possibility of rectification because they require you not to use race as an indicator of how you're going to distribute resources. But maybe we should use race as a way of distributing resources because it's a way of rectifying prior injustice. Right? There's another kind of project, but I'm running out of time. So I'm going to say, I'm also interested in how we embed values into systems. And there's a kind of difficult question. There's these new senior home care systems that use computer vision that I'm interested in to kind of track and survey seniors in their homes to provide like more higher quality care. But there's lots of serious trade-offs between all sorts of values that the elders themselves might have, and then also conflicts between their children who might want them to be more closely surveyed than they would like to be surveyed, between them and home carers who might feel like they're entering into a workplace that is like a high surveillance workplace. And then there's got this question, who gets to prioritize, whose values get prioritized, how do they get embedded, how do we decide, right? And these are like the central questions of political philosophy and philosophy of science. And so that's why, I use those tools, particularly from feminist philosophy of science and feminist political philosophy, to kind of look at those questions. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, John. I'm curious to hear when we again get to Q&A more about this second project that you brought up. All right, Darshan, are you ready to go? Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna start sharing my screen and then we'll see what happens. Okay, can you all see my slides? All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to the panel. My name is Darshan Mir, and I'm an assistant professor of computer science at Bucknell University. So it's kind of interesting, when I first came across the book, Data Feminism, it kind of helped me think about a coherent framework around the different kind of even disparate interests I had developed over the last 7 or 8 years since I've graduated from being a graduate student. So I want to talk a little bit about, my own unique scholarly trajectory, a little bit about that, and then go into how, what are the specific kind of projects that I'm looking at across my teaching, scholarship, and mentoring that intersect with some of these principles. So my scholarly trajectory began from studying privacy, in particular statistical and mathematical models of privacy, as a graduate student. And this is the title of my dissertation. And soon enough, I realized that privacy in the unequal societies we live in is a contested concept, and it is animated by underlying power differentials in society. and that studying privacy and characterizing it mathematically and computationally is fundamentally an act of injecting power by describing what ought to be private and who or what ought to be protected and in what way. Okay. And you can see this other kind of keyword in my dissertation title, the notion of utility. And Amy and John have spoken about that a little bit. The utility from data, it's not a neutral concept, as my mathematical equations would have me believe. And so from that kind of journey, broadly speaking, in both my teaching and scholarship, I examine the societal implications of computing, whether in the form of studying privacy or exploring ethical implications of technology or examining questions of fairness, justice, and bias in machine learning and other automated systems and what the underlying kind of epistemological models are. Right? At Bucknell, I also teach courses in computer science for both computer science and non-computer science majors. And I also teach what we call foundation seminars that are writing intensive courses for first-year students from all disciplines. And I mentor undergraduate students. So at a high level, I strive to engage with questions about power. And in this brief kind of presentation, I will give you 3 examples of my scholarship, teaching, and mentoring that are animated by considerations of power and context. So in one collaborative project with Vanessa Massaro, who's a geographer, a qualitative geographer, Nathan Ryan, a mathematician, and Swaroop Dhar, who's a rising senior in computer science engineering, we are examining data spanning the last 30 years from the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. Now, this data is not public, as Amy would like it to be, and we would all like it to be. This is data that we got from writing a proposal to the Department of Corrections, who gave us 30 years of data on basically every single person who has gone through the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. So we are examining this data to problematize the use of data-driven decision-making in the criminal justice system in Pennsylvania. In particular, through a case study of this data, we are in particular looking at a tool that is used in the Department of Corrections in Pennsylvania. It's called the Pennsylvania Additive Classification Tool that classifies inmates into custody levels, starting from the least restricted to the most restrictive. And what we seek to do is we seek to uncover the weaknesses of so-called technological sophistication in the context of criminal justice. The pact, this tool itself, it's confidential. We cannot examine the source code. We can only look at the output that the data indicates. It was originally implemented based on the National Institutes of Corrections encouragement for jurisdictions to create a so-called objective classification system for placing prisoners into an institution after intake. So our aim is to uncover various kinds of biases in this tool and problematize the very notion of objectivity there. We also want to argue that data-driven decision-making, marked by relying on data to automate decisions about people who are convicted of crimes in Pennsylvania, it obfuscates the inequalities and the biases baked in the system by reinforcing assumptions about the system's legitimacy. Right? So those are kinds of things that we want to examine. Going on to kind of looking at examining power in the context of teaching, I teach a first-year writing course at Bucknell University that examines the implications of data-centric technologies in society at large. I want to help students examine how data-centric processes and practices can become instruments that reinforce and exacerbate inequality in society. And we talk a lot about the Compass case study that John had talked about earlier. And what I also want to help them do is I don't want to, want for them to drown into kind of a sea of hopelessness. I'm going to make sure that next time I teach the course, Amy's work is really, out there for them to see an example of, not just critique, but also how can we practice and change things. I also want to help them identify both relevant problems and solutions to contribute to a more equal, just society. I want to help them see that there are those possibilities. In another kind of upper level course that is that I teach to computer science majors, I help students understand first the technical fundamentals underlying systems that are used to make decisions about people's lives. These are the kinds of systems that John was talking about, and help them understand the bias, fairness, privacy, and transparency implications of these systems. But more importantly, after equipping them with some of the technical fundamentals, I also want them to think a little more critically about what are these various notions of fairness, and that they're not all neutral. And just as John was talking about, there are different kinds of considerations. One notion of fairness is not the same, is not on the same moral footing as another notion of fairness, right? They have different kind of power implications. Finally, one of my aims is to help equip the next generation of students, and particularly computer science students I educate, with tools of data feminism. In 2019, a student of mine, Anushika Sharma, who was a double major in women's and gender studies and computer science, wrote an honors thesis on contextualizing sexual assault data on college campuses. The project she undertook employed a human-centered socio-technical approach to understanding the data collection processes associated with sexual assault, specifically on the campus of Bucknell University. Anushika's interest was to identify the underlying kind of metadata within the data collection process, to contextualize and critique the process of data collection, reporting, and usage. Right? She identified the gaps in the data collection process that could result in an underreporting of sexual assault statistics, particularly on Bucknell's campus. In addition, she also employed participatory approaches to kind of illustrate a process of data collection, sharing, and usage that would incorporate and center students and their experiences. And so in general, through each of these questions, through each of these projects, as you can imagine, these are all really entangled with questions of examining power. That consideration is primary. But so are questions of, considerations of questioning power, elevating emotions, questioning hierarchies, and often considering context. And if I'm happy to answer any questions, if you want to get in touch with me offline, here's my email, and then Twitter is a big deal these days, or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Emily, you ready? Right.
I'm also going to share my screen. So thank you for inviting me to join the panel. And as many of you know and participated in, we ran a reading group this spring around data feminism. So it was great to have all of the Mellons participate in that as well. And Whitney also participated. So I'm going to talk about a project that I've been working on for the last year and a half called the New York Data Carpentries Library Consortium. And this really started in line with a lot of the concepts in data feminisms about thinking about the need for greater education around data literacies and how we as a consortium of upstate New York librarians might be able to more fully support that. And we wanted to make sure we were thinking about supporting those efforts across the region, not just in our own institutions, which were all private and pretty privileged, but across the public sector and thinking about school librarians as well. So the consortiums really wanted to address two interwoven needs, and I want to apologize up front for the copious amount of text you're going to see on these slides. I normally don't like that, but definitions are important. So we really wanted to make sure that we increased librarians' capacity to meet their patrons' requirements for data and digital literacies, and that have become increasingly central to research, teaching, and civic participation. So we understood that people really need to understand how to use data and analyze it and question it in order to engage more fully just as people within our civil society. We also understood that it is impossible to know all of the data skills and to be able to have them. And so we wanted to work together to be able to meet those demands in a sustainable and equitable way. And if we think about that more simply, there's just an increasing need, right? We have a broader need to understand data and digital methods and tools, and that is ever increasing. That is true across institutions. That's not just something that we have to think about in higher ed, but we have to think about that for schools and academic and public and medical and a lot of different institutions. And again, here I'm coming from the perspective of working in libraries, but that is true really across all publics, as we're starting to see in our conversations today. And I want to say the consortium has the potential, and I've italicized that specifically, to provide more local and ongoing progress. And I'll return to the has the potential later when I talk about lessons we have learned. So we chose the Carpentries as a model, and carpentries.org, if someone could drop that in the chat, I should have had that copied, is a nonprofit that is a network of volunteers who teach coding and data science skills. And their mission is to build a global capacity in essential data and computational skills for conducting efficient, open, and reproducible research. Thank you. Data literacies we're defining as the ability to read, work with, analyze, and argue with data visualizations, and critically assess the veracity of data. And then data carpentry, based on the Carpentries model, it really focuses on workshops that teach hands-on methods and fundamental data skills for conducting research. And that might include very things that in data feminisms they would call showing your labor, right? The wrangling, the cleaning, the transforming, the analyzing, the raw data, and building on those computational methods. So it's sort of messy and it's complicated and there's a lot of different aspects to it, but that's what we were trying to do, is think about how we could get people those skills. So it's a big consortium. It is funded by an IMLS project planning grant, 1 year, which is now 2 years because there was a global pandemic. We've worked with the Carpentries to run some workshops and also do training. And then there is a wide range of librarians working across Central and Western New York to help run these workshops, share their skills, develop their skills in order to hopefully share those skills with others. So since September of 2019, we have done some environmental scans, some successfully, some not so successfully. In higher ed, we're still working on the school and public librarians. Those were sent out at the start of the pandemic at a time when people did not really have the capacity to be able to respond to our surveys, which made a lot of sense. We hosted several workshops and we did pedagogy training. So we now have 16 instructors from across the region who are trained in that Carpentries pedagogy model. We ran several skill building workshops in 2019 and 2020 that had over 100 people in attendance amongst the 3 workshops. And then some of the steering committee members formed the working group on data and the humanities for the Central New York Humanities Corridor and ran the Data Feminism virtual reading group this spring, which originally we had interest from 85 people across 14 institutions all over the country actually interested in participating. And we ended up with about 50 people over the course of 4 sessions participating, which is great. So as I said, a global pandemic happened in the middle of our 1-year planning grant. And so we ended up having to postpone a bunch of our activities. This summer, we're working on developing more hands-on skill building workshops based on feedback we've received from people and specific interests, and thinking about developing targeted workshops for particularly public and school librarians. We're working with our local councils to develop some focus groups. And there's a lot of needs behind that really relate to the data feminism work. We really need to understand how we target the public and school librarians. This is something that we have really struggled with, even though we have public and school librarians in our steering committee. We just haven't been able to understand how we reach those audiences in a way that gets them into the workshops and help us think about how we develop those workshops to be very targeted. So running a grant in a global pandemic is hard. It turns out that people do not have the capacity or the ability to do this work, and that makes sense because public libraries are being closed and people are being furloughed, and there are very real concerns, and we have to understand that and take that into account. We are asking them to do more labor here and participate with us, and sometimes that's hard to justify when there are other things going on. We should give the funds directly to the councils. That was always the original plan, but it turned out with the planning grant, when we did it, it was very quick, and it ended up being mostly run by University of Rochester and our other institutions. And really that money should just be, just as they say in data feminism, that money should just go straight to the councils. They do this work, they're really good at it, they know how to reach their audiences, and we would love to help support them in doing that more. We have to work harder and earlier to understand the needs of the people we're trying to reach. We were pretty clear about what our own institutions needed, but it wasn't quite as clear to us how to engage more fully with our public and school librarians and what their needs were. And actually even their needs within those different groups vary widely. So what sort of people working with backend data sets needs versus what people working with the public need, they're all very different. And so really taking time to work harder and understand. We need to listen more closely for potential barriers to participation. Sometimes it's really hard to justify to your boss why you should get to participate in this type of work, or why learning data skills will actually be useful to your job and to your communities. And so we need to be better about articulating our outcomes and what we hope people to gain out of being trained in different data skills. And then really the one big takeaway that we've started working on right now is develop very targeted workshops. What we choose for our data sets matter. People have to be able to see themselves in the work, to be able to take the time to learn the thing. And so the application of those data sets also matter. It has to be a way that people understand how it will relate to their work and their lives and what they want to do. And then communication matters. If we're using jargon terms that do not relate to the people we're trying to get to, it's not going to help. They're not going to want to work with us. They're not going to want to learn new things. They're not going to be willing to take on that extra labor. So with many thanks to the IMLS and our steering committee members, current and previous, I also want to thank Sarah Pugachev, who is at University of Rochester and served as an instructor for several of our workshops and donated a lot of her time. She's been a tremendous support to the project. And that's it.
Thank you, Emily. And last but not least, Whitney, whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. Thank you to Maddie and Wade and Byron for the invitation. I'm so delighted to be thinking with you all today. There's already so many threads that I can't wait to pick up on in our conversation. My name is Whitney Speraza, and I'm an assistant professor of English and Digital Humanities at RIT. And my specific area of expertise is like way of left field in this conversation because I am a scholar of 16th and 17th century English literature, particularly women's writing. But I was trained in really highly interdisciplinary spaces, largely because of my interest in digital humanities. And so I think you'll hear as I talk that even my like more traditional sort of English literature work is really informed by not just data feminism and the sort of feminist critiques coming out of the digital humanities field. But one of the things that I'm really excited always about is sort of the contact zones between different academic disciplines and how those contact zones foster particularly dynamic new questions. John already had a really wonderful example of this in his own work. I love that, like positioning my own sort of intellectual network slide. I think I need to use one of those in the future. So I'm currently at work on two projects that I think of as kind of data feminism in practice, but for different reasons. So I'll just sort of offer a brief overview of both of them, and then we can pick up any more details later. The first is my book project, my in-progress book on women's poetry and the history of science. And this book focuses on 16th and 17th century England. This is a historical moment when the science part of data science was really starting to crystallize. So John's questions about like what makes science science really resonate in my work as well. So the methods and kinds of knowledge that we now deem scientific really start to be shaped and bounded by predominantly white male institutions in the 16th and 17th century. So the Royal Society in England is a really perfect example of this, founded by King Charles II in 1660, right? And still in practice today as the world's oldest national scientific institution. a quick sort of data feminism reference point for this, Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio define science in the beginning, in the introduction to data feminism, as a commitment to systemic methods of observation and experiment. And I think part of what my book is trying to do is really speak back to this definition. So if we consider the historical contexts and origins of this one particular version of science, how can our definition of science change and become more capacious? If we have a better understanding of alternative forms of scientific work throughout history, right? How can we open space for a wider range of voices and thinkers? So really the book is interrogating what counts as science, why does it count as science, and how can history help us widen our net for what counts? So in my book, in this book, I turn to early women's poetry as one potential site for scientific work. So for instance, there's a really interesting poet writing right around the time that the Royal Society was being founded. Her name is Margaret Cavendish. And Emily, if you could pop her name in the chat, I want everyone to go and look her up after this. So in her published book of poems, I only asked Emily because I know she'll know how to spell it. So in Cavendish's published book of poems, she explains poetic form by comparing it to flesh, blood, skin, and bone. So Cavendish argues that the language of poetry, words, are shadows without substance. For Cavendish, poetic form is where the value of poetry lies, and poetic form is analogous to the body's flesh, blood, skin, and bone. So in my research on Cavendish, I'm studying how poetry is materialized by this anatomical analogy she gives us at the start of her poems. Poetic and anatomical form really collide in Cavendish's assertion, and poetry becomes a kind of organic, fleshly thing. So what would it mean to read Cavendish's poetry collection as a scientific experiment? I'm seeing so many Cavendish fans popping up in the chat right now, and that really makes me happy. So if we take this collision of anatomy and poetics seriously, how does such a formulation change our engagement with poetry? And ultimately, this brings me back to the book's sort of really big question, which is, what can poetry teach us about science? And so if we pick up on Klein and D'Ignazio's definition of science and try to crack open some alternatives, I think I'm really thinking about forms of what D'Ignazio and Klein, following, of course, Patricia Hill Collins's work, call subjugated knowledge, right? So the alternative practices and ways of making knowledge that have been pushed out or dismissed by mainstream institutions. My book is really working to excavate some alternative kinds of scientific knowledge making through poetry, in this case, that we can use to think differently about the science in data science. And then the second project I'll just speak very briefly about is a digital humanities project that I'm building together with a group of faculty, students, staff, community educators, and activists called Resistance Mapping. And Emily is a part of this as well. So perhaps she'll have some stuff to say about it too. But this is a portal into space-based racism and resistance in Rochester, New York. And the project is in its very early stages. We're still sort of in the prototype building stage. But why I wanted to sort of bring it up today, and what I want to talk about a little bit, is that there's a lot, even in this project's foundation, that aligns with the data feminist principles. So we've tried to put in place, right from the project start, a really kind of decentered collective approach to the work. And when I say decentered, what I mean is that this project is not going to be owned or branded by any one institution or any one person even. So this is actually, it's hard to find models for digital humanities projects that look like this, that are kind of collaboratively or regionally led. because of course of funding structures and academic institutional structures. But we're following, I think, a really useful model from the Colored Conventions Project, which I will indeed put this in the chat myself as part of something to sort of think about alongside this conversation. We've worked extra hard to ensure that we could have faculty, staff, and students from both RIT and U of R on the project. And these core team members come from a wide range of backgrounds and fields. The students are both graduate and undergraduate students. So we have a lot of different kinds of voices and areas of expertise in the mix as we're building this prototype. And we've also started setting up some broader regional partnerships. There's a great sort of decentered humanities project model coming out of the Central New York Humanities Corridor program. So we're using that a little bit. We also fought really hard to pay our student workers well and ensure that the student team members were getting paid the same amount across the different institutions, which it turns out is a lot harder than you might think. Just to say like, no, everyone on this project is getting X dollar amount. So even though we're paying them out of 5 different pools of money in 5 different organizational spaces, like that dollar amount needs to be the same. And then just as a final note, one of the most exciting things about the resistance mapping project for me is that this core team that we have working on the prototype right now is really just the tip of the iceberg. So the team's work is constantly sort of interfacing with community activists and educators who are building anti-racist curriculum for Rochester City schools. And so part of what the project is aiming to do ultimately is to create supportive and mutually beneficial partnerships between Rochester's academic institutions and its community, right? These are notoriously fraught and often traumatic histories of relations between community spaces and activism and university scholarship, the sort of siloed scholarship models we all know so well. So the project is really trying to dismantle some of that, even as we sort of acknowledge that it is part of our history. A key kind of long-term goal of this project is to empower K-12 students to create new content for the website. So even though resistance mapping is coming out of academic institutional spaces and is meant to support the teaching of the anti-racist curriculum, so for community teachers, eventually, we really want this to be a space for the students who are learning the curriculum to showcase their responses to it, their reflections on it, and any kind of new creative work of their own that comes out of their learning as they process the histories of Rochester that we're documenting. So I'll stop there just as a bit of a snapshot, but I'm looking forward to continued conversations today.
Amazing. Okay, we have a lot to work with. I just want to add before I kind of jump into some questions that I've written up for this discussion, that if anyone in the audience has questions, please just drop it into the chat box and we will get to those probably in 20 minutes or so, but feel free to ask whatever you'd like in there. So to start, I was diligently taking notes and there's so much to work with here, but Whitney, something that you had said, that the Patricia Hill Collins quote or term about subjugated knowledge, I feel like speaks really well to all the presentations we heard today, in the sense that I feel like so much of how we work with data depends on keeping certain subject positions hidden, keeping certain terms in the dark. For example, I want to talk more about fairness and how this term gets instrumentalized as something that's like a given or something that is not constructed by society. We always just assume that it's a fact, but it's not. And so I kind of wanted to turn the question to talk about, in data feminism, there's a term that they call feminist objectivity. And the authors talk about how feminist objectivity is, instead of our usual impulse to like hide our subject position or our experiences, to kind of bring that out into the open. And that can be something like, as a researcher, making your stakes clear and making your background and your experience clear. Like, why are you doing this project? Why does it matter to you? And typically those things kind of remain hidden. So I wanted to hear more from you all. I know this is a long question, but kind of about your own personal experience with trying to come to terms with being more transparent, not just with your data sets or like the work that you're doing, but as a researcher as well. Like, what does that look like to be in this feminist objectivity mindset? Whoever wants to go first can, but I don't want to make anyone talk if they don't want to.
So I'll go first. So I think I think feminist objectivity is a kind of really interesting concept, and I'm interested in it from the perspective of, I think science like comes with this like package, like this packaged understanding that it's objective, right? And that it's like neutral, and that it produces knowledge reliably, regardless of who is doing the science, right? And so, that understanding, I think, has really led to this vision of where the fact that science is like totally colonized by mostly white people, mostly men from mostly well-advantaged positions in society, is seen by a lot of people as not a problem, right? Because science is supposed to be done. Science just does its thing, and we get the right answer from the process, and it doesn't matter who's pulling the levers on the science machine just comes out with the right answers. And I think one of the really rich contributions of feminist philosophy of science over the last kind of 20 years has been showing that this is just fundamentally untrue. I'm thinking in particular of Elizabeth Lloyd's work on the science of the female orgasm, right? And how it was like theories of why the evolution of the female orgasm were just really bad for decades, right? And it wasn't until kind of she excavated that she kind of dug into the topic that we ended up with a functional theory of the evolution of female orgasm. That's like a small example of how positionality and people and kind of epistemic diversity is ultimately really fundamental to the core project of knowledge production and getting at truth, which is supposed to be the lodestar of science. And so when we think about science as this objective, this objective system, actually to get the objectivity, we need to think about the positionality of all the agents doing the science, right? And that's what gets us true objectivity rather than objectivity light, right? That we're kind of used to dealing with.
Amy?
We've really struggled with this idea of objectivity. I mentioned that we no longer say that we're neutral. We say we're not partisan, but we've really, really struggled with it, in part because in order for us to get the data at all, law enforcement basically has to agree to give it to us, or people who run courts. So what we found is that we can't pull punches. We have to be very descriptive. And where we get into problems sometimes is when we give any kind of judgment on a measure. So sometimes I wonder if we're taking the punch out but then the punch really comes from the people that are using it. So it's an extremely hard line to walk. And we, like, when we use the term mass incarceration, we get people saying they don't want to work with us anymore because they don't agree with that. But you can talk about, for example, decarceration. You can talk about, you don't want to, somehow eliminating mass incarceration is offensive to some lawmakers, but reducing jails and prison, that isn't, because everybody knows you need to do that for money, to increase fairness, and for public safety. So, like, we found that we're often, really walking on eggshells in order to do this, and it's exhausting. Like, when I work with advocates, I'm like amazed at the things that they can say. I'm like, oh my God, you can just say that because we're doing all this work to be trusted, and vetted, and and valid. So it's a very tricky business. And I want to apologize that in a few minutes, I'm going to have to jump off, but I've loved this conversation. And I want to thank everybody for letting me be a part of it. I'm happy to follow up in any way that you guys deem fit. I want to hear more for now.
Amy, for those points you just made me think of something that D'Ignazio said in her presentation about having access to the data, but not the source code. And I'm really interested in thinking about that in relation to your question, Maddie, like at what points in this sort of process, because Amy, then you talked about this sort of problem of use, like you have access to the data, but then it doesn't sort of get used in the way that is like the best or most, just. And so these moments of like disruption where we sort of lose track of the ideologies of like what's been put into the process at different stages.
Yeah, and I just quickly want to speak to that a little bit, because what in the course of this research project, which is in progress, the one that's looking at the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, we have experienced, I'm guessing, a sliver of what you experience, Amy, because even just writing up that research proposal, what is it that we are going to investigate? We were always totally walking on eggshells, because on the one hand, we are writing a proposal to the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, convincing them to give us the data to really investigate biases in their practices, right? And then on the other hand, Vanessa, who is one of our team members and one of the kind of leads in the project, she's a qualitative geographer, and she has these professional relationships for a long time working with prior inmates, right? So knowing the details of their lives and how these kinds of algorithmic decisions, so to speak, are impacting their lives, right? So it's just really interesting kind of talking about the ideologies, and quite clearly we are committed to a certain ideology of racial justice, right? But then how do you kind of talk about it in a way that's going to not ensure that it's going to ensure that you keep getting some of that data so you can keep studying and examining it, but then it's always a tightrope. So.
Yeah, I will just say that I appreciated how much the authors of the book continually reassert their positionality. I think it makes it very clear that that they're taking that into account as they're trying to have these discussions. It was definitely something that the original sort of steering committee on our grant was cognizant of, because we were all coming from private institutions with lots of, privilege. And what we wanted to do was be able to help share some of the data skills and make sure that people were trained in a thoughtful way. And I think even with that intention, we've had to come back over and over again and just be like, it's not about us. How can we meet their needs, right? Like, and so that's something that we continually have to remind ourselves. So our positionality is very much a part of it.
Right. I guess too, I'm thinking about, like in your example, Emily, you're talking about, the importance of data literacy, which is a way to kind of break down this hierarchy of like, oh, as a person in a very privileged position of being a researcher at a private institution, I'm kind of giving away like a lot of my power by wanting to empower other people to have this literacy in something that is intentionally, again, hidden. Data is a way to maintain power as much as it can be a way to dismantle it. And I think that like hearing everyone talk today, most of us have examples of both where it's used in both ways. So I'm curious too about, and D'Ignazio, your student's project is actually what kind of made me think about this, how she was, kind of investigating the data process at Bucknell in terms of collecting information about sexual assault, where, it's obviously very empowering to be able to gain knowledge around these processes, but at the same time, what do you do when you're in this position of power and the knowledge that you gain can end up being harmful, or it can end up like, I think in the book, they call it the paradox of exposure, where collecting data on vulnerable populations, it is important to prove a point, but in fact, it can end up kind of doing more damage than you intended by maybe proving something that is, then used to kind of create more oppression. So I'm not sure if that's a clear question, but if the four of you can speak to that, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, just because you, talked about the student's thesis. Yeah, we were, and Nishika in particular was very well aware of, her unique positionality in this whole process. And I think it's important to mention that, she saw herself, this was a project that this was her honors thesis, it was her project, it was her kind of, her baby. And she both thought of herself and presented herself as somebody who was kind of inhabiting the same kind of a similar shared subjectivity as the students that she was organizing focus groups with, right? And that was quite clear. And in addition, I think she was using, literature and best practices from, I think that's how we discovered the book, actually, Data Feminism, is when she actually was doing her project. And so the book was still in draft form. And we were talking about it at one point, and I was like, Anushika, this seems like something you should be looking at, right? So I think she was very cognizant of those kinds of factors and of the positionality that she inhabited, but that also that it was a difference. It wasn't me doing the project, it was her, right? She was the researcher. And I think that makes a difference, and making that clear and having that shared experience and shared subjectivity with the participants. I think that's a little different.
With sexual assault data too, this is one thing I worked on a little bit in other contexts, but I take up sexual assault in my book because as a lot of the poets I'm working on confront how women's bodies are represented by science, by anatomical science in the period. A lot of it is very exploitative, very voyeuristic, very the female body is used as a tool basically to sell books, right? Like anatomists can slap a dissected woman's body on the front title page of their book and other men will buy it. And so I've been thinking a lot about how like the narratives that I'm tracing in these historical documents, but then also in the context of like Title IX data and sexual assault data circulating in our contemporary moment, especially around academic spaces, there's also the potential for the data to become a kind of triggering mechanism, right? And so not even just the exposure, the paradox of exposure here, where we have, you know, so much silence surrounding the topic of sexual assault, partly because of the risk of exposing oneself and documenting that experience, but also because that data and any information you offer about it, qualitative or quantitative, is always potentially going to be a moment of re-traumatization, which I think is really an important part of this conversation too.
Well, and as they bring up in the book, to that point, Whitney, sometimes the universities that appear to have the greater numbers of sexual assault are actually the people who are putting the most resources toward attempting to record more robust qualitative and quantitative data around this issue. And so even the data that we're receiving is not always as clear cut as our assumptions around it.
Right, and I think too, what you were just saying, Whitney, about like understanding that we're working with people who could potentially be re-traumatized by having to account or having to subject themselves to being data. Like, I think that is a huge part of data feminism, which is like acknowledging the emotions that are at stake. You know, this is very potentially re-traumatizing material to be working with. I think too, this is a bit unrelated, but I was thinking as we were talking about surveillance, which I feel like is a huge, you know, buzzword, but also an important thing to discuss here as well. And John, in your project that you were looking at, I was curious to hear more about the second one about senior homes. And again, this kind of data that's intended maybe for seemingly good use, but then can be turned around so quickly and be instrumentalized in very problematic ways. So if you could just talk more about that, because I just wanted to hear more, and you know, these presentations were so short. So
sure.
Yeah,
I think it's relevant to the Title IX question as well. So part of the impulse in a lot of data science projects is to just collect as much data as possible, right? Without really a good sense of what the kind of goal of collecting that data is ultimately going to be, without a good sense of like what the kind of costs to the individuals who are having that data collected is going to be in terms of their privacy, in terms of things like re-traumatization in the Title IX case, in terms of, you know, potential confidentiality exposure, etc. And I think part of what's important about the data feminism outlook is saying, listen, it's really important to frame the goal of the research or the goal of the project from the start, because that's going to help you navigate and deal with all of these kind of questions about, you know, are we really helping people ultimately? Because when you get in and this is relevant to the senior care case, what you get into trouble when all you're doing is just kind of hoovering up data and then going on a fishing expedition to figure out how you might use that to predict, you know, whether someone's developing dementia or whether someone is going to have a fall in their home or whether they are being treated well by their employee, right? So the problem is that once you hoover up all this data, it then becomes, there's this like impulse to try and find ways to use it. And often those ways are not going to be, you might find a way to use it, but it might not be kind of the best kind of use of that data, right? Like you might end up exploiting workers, right? Or you might end up, you know, over surveying or impinging on the autonomy of the elder, right? Or you might, you know, invade people's privacy, right? And so I think it's always important, this is the lesson I get out of the kind of data feminism discussion, is it's always important to frame the issue first with with a goal that's oriented towards just outcomes, and then decide what data you're gonna collect and how that's gonna help.
John, on this point, you're reminding me of Lauren and Catherine's point last night about the question of what is the potential for harm, right, in this project, in this data set, as we gather data, right? So keeping that question as part of the framing apparatus.
Yeah, Whitney, I think they also talk about the setting up your values up front. So sort of like getting yourself a set of values up front. And then, you know, I don't know those of you who have read the full book, but they also do a great job at the end of talking about the metrics they set up to judge themselves by, and then whether or not they met those. And they were very clear about that. So not just the values, but like what does success look like if we're trying to move towards justice and not, and then try to stay accountable to those as you move forward. Sorry, Direction.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say then there's the flip side of it, which is when you're examining data that's been already collected, such as the case of the PA Department of Corrections or other context of criminal justice, instead of, we're not in a position to set up values, but we're definitely in a position to uncover values, which is that these data are generated for a particular purpose and context, and that particular purpose and context is related to controlling and disciplining, right? Rather than data for some other purposes, which is also why you can critique and, ask the question, why are certain kinds of data collected and not others? So if you're designing an algorithm to, say, decide whether or not somebody should get parole or whether or not somebody should be high risk or low risk, we are not collecting, as Kathy O'Neill in her book Weapons of Math Destruction points out, we're not collecting data about people's hobbies. We're not collecting what kinds of, other interests do they have in their lives. We're not collecting more expansive data about them. We're collecting just data in the course of punishing, controlling, and disciplining. That's the kind of incidental data that's being collected, and therefore the kinds of purpose that is used for, those purposes are not neutral. They are related to those purposes of control and punishment. So.
Yes, that is an amazing counterpoint. And your statement, why are certain kinds of data collected and not others, reminds me of also in the presentation, in Lauren and in Catherine's presentation last night, they talked about the library of missing data sets, which is this, I guess I have an art history background, so I see it as like an installation piece, but it really is also like a project that goes so far beyond just art. But it's, filing cabinets that are on display that are showing, data sets that exist and what is missing from those data sets, and kind of shedding light on the fact that, like, just because a data set doesn't exist doesn't mean that the question at hand isn't important, and then vice versa. Just because we have a data set doesn't mean that the reason for collecting such data is a just one. So this is a very simple question, a long explanation for a simple question. I guess I'm just curious, in your own personal research too, like, are there missing data sets that you wish existed, or like when you have encountered the missing data set in your own work, how have you kind of confronted that obstacle?
I think to speak to like the project that Whitney and I are working on, the resistance mapping project, there are bits of data out there that sometimes we don't know yet are data sets, right? So I think about the racial covenant data that is sitting in people's deeds for housing all over Rochester that says who can and cannot live in that neighborhood. And it was, it's this tiny little footnote in a deed. And so most people have no idea it's there. And so that is a data set that has been in the process of being uncovered. And that requires, talking about making your labor visible, a tremendous amount of labor to go through and digitize those records and then make them so that we can read them and pull that data. But so I think that there's two, in my mind, when in our research, like there's two parts of that question, which is sometimes the data is there and we just don't know it because it exists in documentation that we don't think of as data. And so we have to go through the archives and find it in a way. And then also, of course, there are lots of data. I think about all of the health data that has been collected in the last year and the health data that has not. And that seems like a very obvious gap in data that is missing, that could be both used for good and nefarious purposes, as they talk about in the book.
Yes, I just want to share an example that I really love sharing with my students. And this is kind of a satirical piece written by the New Inquiry, along with associated code. I don't know if some of you are familiar with this, but this is kind of, replicating the process. For those of you who are aware, there's a system called Parole, which is a predictive system to predict which neighborhoods is the next crime going to happen, right? Based on past patterns of crime. Now, for everybody in this panel, we can all understand that these processes have a certain kind of racial history, and that we are going to end up policing neighborhoods that are already heavily policed, so setting up these so-called feedback loops, right? And so one of the questions we talk about in my writing class and in my ethics class here at Bucknell is, what kinds of prediction systems are we building and what are we not building? And this kind of piece from the New Inquiry is really fantastic, because when I present this to my students, they laugh, right? They're like, okay, this is a system it's an early warning system for white collar crime. And guess where white collar crime happens, right? It happens where there's a lot of money. And where's that? That's, the Wall Street in New York City, right? And so then we talk about, well, why is that funny? Why is it funny? It's funny because as a society, you don't expect to police this kind of behavior, even though it has arguably a far more detrimental effect on a lot of people's lives. Whereas something like, smoking pot that arguably doesn't is more heavily policed and more criminalized. So we talk about that, as an example of what gets counted and what doesn't get counted.
I mean, I can just jump in. That's a wonderful example, Rakshan and Emily, your points about the resistance mapping data. Yes, absolutely. And I think, like, for me too, working in historical archives, I am constantly confronted with absence and like things I wish were there that we could never get because of these things happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I have I'll put some of it in the chat. I have some colleagues working on plague data, which of course is really sort of interesting and compelling in our current moment, and the plague death rolls and things like that are really interesting from the perspective of, like, our current sort of critiques of data systems and what it means to count people and health phenomena. But if you sort of put these historical documents in the conversation, just a whole new set of questions arises.
I think, let me just scroll through real fast. I just want to make sure we have time for audience questions too. Let's see. Okay, we have one from Nancy. She wrote, Sandra Harding's claim that the closer, more intimate researchers are to the phenomenon of interest achieves objectivity because of the deep knowledge gained. How do the panelists think about issues of researcher positionality? For example, genders, racialization, minoritization, majority status, etc., in relation to feminist objectivity?
So I love Sandra Harding's work. Not a philosopher, so it's great. I'm going to claim her. She wears many hats, but yeah. I think this is like one of the central insights, right? Like if you want objectivity, it behooves you to ensure that you are, finding people who represent positionalities, a diverse set of positionalities that are relevant to the question at hand. And my view on this, I think, is probably what's called moderate standpoint epistemology. So I think my view is it's not that you need to unthinkingly trust the testimony of people simply because they occupy a particular position. And I think that's the caricature that people have of standpoint epistemology, that you must accept the claims of a person because of their like race or gender or whatever. But that's not really, I think, how we ought to think about standpoint epistemology. It's a way of recognizing that who we place trust in the testimony of, which peoples we place trust in the testimony of is already filtered by all sorts of social structuring and oppression. And so it's in our interest to pay more attention to people who have been historically marginalized and their testimony, because we're conditioned not to pay attention to those people, right? And so we kind of discount their testimony, their claims, in a way that's detrimental to our own like way of finding truth, right? And so I think, yeah, and Nancy's in the polls asks, how might you do that when you're analyzing gathering quantitative data? And yeah, that is difficult, right? I think part of it is you need money and time and labor to go out and collect the data in a responsible way, right? You can't just use existing data sets because they're often not representative. I mean, my favorite example of this is genome-wide association studies. So our collection of genomic data is hopelessly biased towards people of European descent. And there have been some efforts to try and broaden the genomic data that we have about with people who are not of European descent, but it has not worked very well, right? And we're still a long way from having a representative picture of what the human genome really looks like and what kind of variation exists in it. I think it takes money, it takes time, it takes labor, right? You can't magic this stuff away.
Does anyone else have a response to this very complicated question?
I mean, I think we also have to, we're constantly confronting the fact that academic spaces are still incredibly white and incredibly privileged. Emily talked a little bit about this, right? Even in just thinking about the kinds of institutions we all come from and how we're situated. And so, yeah, I think it's an excellent question, Nancy, but I do think that the sort of systemic problems we still have with who gets space to do research on data and things like that is also part of this conversation.
I have one more, I think we have time for one more question. So Byron was asking, to what degree, this is for D'Ignazio, to what degree has the field of data science started teaching these things? I guess referring to, I guess Nancy's question. To what degree is there hope that the industry will start to, I might unmute Byron and have him just ask the question. Oops, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. No, I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, obviously, I was really impressed with some of the stuff you were talking about on like from like how do you design a syllabus, but also how you were mentoring your students, D'Ignazio. I think that's like also a really important conversation that we have to have besides just our own work. But yeah, so obviously you're very engaged with these types of, questions of feminism and power in data. but like to what degree, because I'm just, you know, I think most of us in the room here are in the humanities, like to what degree do you feel like the data science field has started to move and adopt some of these more like humanist concerns, and you know, the industry is like a whole other question, but I assume you still like are kind of more have your ear to the ground about the industry more than like someone like me.
Probably not, but I think I occupy my own bubble. But thank you, John, for that. There is a representative conference of interest, the ACM, which is the Professional Organization for Computer Scientists, where arguably you might be able to locate data scientists, though that is another whole discussion. This is fairness, accountability, and trust in algorithmic systems, or in everything in general, right? Everything data related, algorithms related. There is another one, the conference on AI ethics in society. And I think the conversation has shifted, say, over the last 4 or 5 years since I've been, you know, a faculty member. And definitely shifted a lot since I was in grad school. When I was in grad school, the only place that I found that was talking about, you know, other than the disciplines of, you know, STS and more kind of humanistic disciplines that I was not, you know, kind of was not in my orbit at that point. I was a computer scientist. And the only place where I, as a graduate student, saw that was Kathy O'Neill's blog. She had a fantastic blog. She still has it, called mathbabe.org. And, you know, ultimately she ended up writing the book, Weapons of Math Destruction. That was the only kind of place that I saw that was talking about these larger issues. So I think the conversation has shifted a lot. But I think there's also so-called ethics washing, right, where people are talking about ethics, but really I think the conversation is unmoored from the larger conversations existing in that have existed, you know, in humanistic fields and in society at large. I think there is still a large gap, but I think every year I always attend. Not last year, but I attend this conference, in the ACM conference in computer science educators. And those are people who are seriously thinking about education in general. And I think within that bubble, there are a lot of people who are seriously thinking about computing education and these larger questions. I don't know to what extent it will get translated to industry standards, and I'm a little pessimistic about that, just because they tend to be, you know, I think we talk about this in my classes all the time, right? It's one thing to kind of inculcate these questions at the individual student level, and then often we come across this question, which is, well, here I am, I've taken the scores and I go and work at this organization, and then what do I do, right? And then we talk about the role of professional organizations, the ACM in particular, or the IEEE, the Institution of Electronic and Electrical Engineers, and there's a sub-society there for computing. And in some ways we talk about the failure of the professional organizations, and my students are quite quick to point that out, right? About not having a collective kind of vision. And again, I feel a little more hopeful because more recently the ACM has kind of updated its code of ethics that seems to be more in line with, you know, some of these larger questions, but I still see a lot of gaps. I see a lot of gaps first at the academic level, but then when we're talking about academic and industry, it's a whole, I think it's very complicated. And I feel like the only kind of tool we have as a computer science educator is the same kind of tool that people have as citizens, which is, I think, insisting on regulation, you know, as opposed to individualized education.
Yeah, I agree with Darshan. there has been a huge shift in the computer science community, particularly in the academic community, towards caring about ethics and wanting to embed it in education. In some ways, I owe my job to this like revolution, right? Like I'm employed to teach a course on AI ethics, right, at Rochester. But I think there's real limits to that, right? Like we're working in the conditions of late capitalism, right? And without regulation of these very powerful entities, it's unlikely that ethics is going to get you very far, because the pressure and incentives in industry in particular are just so skewed that even well-motivated people can be led to marginalize or overlook problems with the products that they're creating, and so I think it's just, you really don't want to put your hope in ethics or in computer science education. You've really got to use collective action, right, to require and demand that there is kind of justice in this space.
Well, to end on that depressing note, we are out of time actually, and I know some of our panelists have other meetings to get to, and it's a beautiful day, at least in Rochester, so hopefully people can get outside. But thank you to our panelists. This was awesome. I love being able to have this very organic conversation about these issues and this book, which is available through MIT Press. One last plug for the book. And we will let you all get on your way. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Maddie.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, organizers.